Right, so it's that time of the year. Well, I mean, everybody's pretty much preoccupied with Christmas, so Merry Christmas, everyone. But I'm more preoccupied with how far behind I am with my garden and my YouTube videos because obviously I launched my website recently. Please take a look at that. The link is in the description. And you can't launch a website without having it significantly take up quite a bit of your time, initially anyway. So I've been working on that. And of course, there's Christmas as well. But no, let's get back to the Snapdragons. So, I've had a few years growing Snapdragons now. And, obviously, like you, if you're new to Snapdragons, I relied heavily on YouTube, and that got me so far. But the trouble with YouTube is the kind of the inconsistency, depending on where you live, what your climate is, etc. It can be quite difficult to piece together all the relevant information that's relevant to your particular circumstances. So let me try and simplify it a bit. So there are two types of snapdragons. That's all you really need to know at this stage. And they are cool season flowering and summer flowering. And if you try and sow let's say if you try and sow cool season snapdragons in the height of summer, they're really going to struggle and you're not going to get the desired result. Now, if you don't know that they're cool season snapdragons, that's going to lead you to feel deflated and like you've failed at growing snapdragons and that somehow they're difficult. And I thought that myself because I also grew them in the wrong temperatures on windowsills and things like that, went above radiators, thinking I was doing the right thing, keeping them warm and toasty, sowing them indoors, when in fact they were really preferring the cool outside circumstances. So the cool snapdragons, even so, really won't survive prolonged periods below -5. I mean, -5 is really your cutoff. If I saw my winter temperatures going to -5 and I had snapdragons outside, I would probably think about bringing them in some sheltered spot somewhere. Now, mine mostly are in the greenhouse, but I do still have some in the garden. Now that I know they can survive frosts, I have left some in the beds. So we had a hard frost and a light frost, and it's the third day, and it's a kind of, even though it's a little bit frosty still this morning, in parts, these have defrosted since the hard frost, and as you can see, they're absolutely fine. So that leads me to another thing another myth really about snapdragons is that we do consider them to be annuals. Now, if you're in the US or Canada and you have, or even up in Scotland, you have those harsher winters, then yes, you probably would prefer to treat your snapdragons as annuals rather than bringing them in or mollycoddling them, etc. But if your winters don't really get much below -5 and they're not prolonged frosts, they will probably survive outside and flower again the following year. Now, for specialty flower growers, they will already know that they come in these groups 1 to 4, and groups 1 and 2 are generally the more cool flowering, and groups 3 to 4 are more, they prefer the warmer summer period. Now, when you're buying snapdragons as just a cottage garden grower and you're new to them, you'll just go to the garden centre and it probably won't say whether they fall into any of those groups. So you are going to have to pay attention to the temperatures on the back of the packet and work out from that. You can extrapolate from that whether they're a spring flowering or a summer flowering plant. They usually give you some guideline on the actual packet of that particular variety of seeds. Now, if you do have colder winters, they will survive pretty well in a polytunnel. Again, you're just going to need to pay attention to your particular temperatures in your particular zone. And we've had a really mild winter so far this year, touch wood. So, my snapdragons have just been absolutely fine and dandy, but we've still got a long way to go. So I may report something different later on, but so far, so good. So the other thing about snapdragons is the height. So sometimes when you buy bedding snapdragons from the garden centres, there's like they grow a particular variety for like hanging baskets and things like that, and they're sort of quite short and a bit boring. And I don't tend to buy my snapdragons like that. It's much better if you like more blousy, taller stemmed snapdragons. It is much better to sort of look on the back again of the packet for the height. What you don't want is a dwarf bedding plant. These to me are the worst kinds. When something is called a bedding plant, I immediately know it's not going to be my kind of plant. So just bear that in mind. What's the other thing about snapdragons? You can pinch out the tips. Now, this is something people always talk about, pinching out the tips. I don't exactly know where that comes from. I like the tall spires, and all snapdragons have branching stems, as far as I'm aware. So I'm not exactly sure what the purpose of pinching out the tips is. I mean, when I pinched out the tips when I used to first watch those YouTube videos, all that happened was I would just slow my plants down even more and get even more frustrated that they took even longer to flower. So I don't do that, and I have looked on speciality sites such as Johnny Seeds, and as far as I'm aware, they don't do that. So I'm not exactly sure where this pinching the tips out comes from. I guess if you want a smaller, bushier plant, it might make sense to pinch out the tip, but I've never wanted smaller, bushy plants, so I don't pinch out the tips. Snapdragons branch anyway. Every single snapdragon I've grown has branching stems, so you don't need to pinch out the tips to get multiple stems of flowers. If you want shorter, stubbier, bushier plants, that may be a reason to pinch out the tips. But other than that, I'm not exactly sure why people do that. Maybe it's a climate thing, depends where you are. It all depends really on your particular climate. So to some extent, you are going to have to figure out growing them yourself, in your own particular set of circumstances. The other thing about them is the small seeds. Now, if you think about when snapdragons are growing, when you're collecting the seeds, there's literally trillions of seeds in each tiny little flower pod, and each stem has what, 10, 20 flower pods on it, seed pods, who knows, a lot anyway. And the reason for that is, of course, and they're tiny, they're smaller than a full stop. And that, of course, is to maximize the germination rate for a plant next year. So each plant then produces, it's a bit like foxgloves, they're the same. They produce sort of all these seed heads, but you don't see that many plants the next year. You'll see a few more foxgloves, but you won't see like the masses and masses of seeds that it's dropped before. One of the ones that corresponds best to seed per plant production is forget-me-nots. So if you plant a couple of forget-me-nots in your garden and they're pretty successful and happy and they go to seed, you will find significantly more forget-me-nots the next year and the next after that. It kind of doesn't really work like that with snapdragons and foxgloves. So they will self-seed, but they don't grow, they don't succeed prolifically. They will succeed, but they won't succeed prolifically, like, for instance, the forget-me-not. So this tells you something about how to grow them. You need a lot of seeds, was what I was going to say, to really be sure that you're going to get a good crop. So that brings me on to, if you are a new grower and you're not growing speciality snapdragons, look at the content on the seed packet, because what you don't want to do is sow. If you're new to sowing foxgloves, you don't want to buy a specific packet that only has, say, 25 seeds like I've done. I'm kind of a bit sore about it, which is why I mention it. Because then even me, and I grow a lot of snapdragons, 25 seeds is really not enough. And I do find that going to more speciality sites online, you can sometimes find that you get more for your money than other more mainstream options. So I get some of my seeds from Premier Seeds Direct, and I've bought from them, Bells of Ireland. They always give me loads when I buy a packet. There's just always tons of them. And I just bought my Cerinthy from there, and I had 50 in the packet, and they've done great. The Cerinthy, actually, they've gone a bit leggy because they've been in the greenhouse and it's been so mild this winter that they haven't really stopped growing, and then they've ended up getting too leggy because it's not spring either. And that I noticed that they sell Snapdragons. They sell them by weight rather than seed number, which I think is a better value way for the customer of buying the seeds. So I'm not sponsored by them, and they certainly haven't asked me to sound them out. I've got no reason to go on about them other than I've bought some great seeds from them, and I tend to get more bang for my buck when I buy packets of seeds from them. You can buy them direct from Amazon, Premier Seeds Direct, or direct from their website. So yeah, but on the note of the seeds, once you've got plants to maturity, you're pretty much going to have seeds for life. So they are a great flower for that, because they just produce so many flowers, so many seeds when they are have finished flowering. So every year you'll just be able to collect the seeds. And I have really now, after an initial investment of seeds, I haven't bought seeds. I mean, I did buy some speciality seeds this year, and that's how I found the 25 seeds in a packet nightmare. But I have packets and packets and packets of my own seeds, so I never am short of Snapdragons now. So in that way, they're really good value, and you should persevere, because once you've got a crop of snapdragons that have gone to seed, so on that note, you must allow them to go to seed rather than pick them. But once you've had that first summer of successful flowers, honestly, even one plant will produce so many seeds for the following year that you won't know what to do with them. And now I end up having too many Snapdragons, if anything. So they're really good once you get into the rhythm of it, and once you start to understand how they grow and the rhythm of them. You can treat them obviously as an annual if you don't think they're going to survive your winter, or if you just can't be bothered with them over winter or anything like that. You can just start them again following spring, or you can start them, of course, in the autumn as well. So if you've got spring flowering ones, you can start them in the autumn. Now, if you've obviously gone to the trouble of starting them late summer, autumn, if it's a mild autumn, you will want to overwinter those, because you don't want to lose your new ones before they've flowered. So I would, and I have done for safekeeping, I've grown them obviously in my greenhouse. But we've had such a mild summer that even my plants outside have just been fine so far. So if you want spring flowering plants to flower early in spring, you can start them late summer, autumn, and then overwinter them in the greenhouse, and they will flower early in the spring. And then you can have a second spring flowering. If you start some then in the winter indoors, then they will flower later, and you can put them straight outside and they will flower later in the spring. And then, of course, you can have your summer stock of flowers. The other thing I was going to say on that note is, if you have got spring flowering, cool flowering Snapdragons, the winter sowing method is fantastic for growing those in. I mean, I have accidentally grown the summer flowers in the winter sowing method, so you can do that as well. If you're unsure, the winter sowing method is actually really good for both Snapdragons, but of course, obviously, one will take longer than the other to mature, and you'll find out even if you don't know. If you want to sow, the winter sowing method, of course, is the bottle method. Excuse, my dog is really annoyed that I'm talking to the computer instead of paying attention to him. So the winter sowing method is, I've done a video on it, so I will link it below. You just grow things in the bottles or the milk jugs, and you just leave them to do their own thing outside, and it's like a little mini greenhouse. And I found that both varieties grew well in the winter sowing method. So I think that is a really foolproof method if you are a beginner, because you can just put in the soil, put the seeds on top, tap them down. Obviously, the soil must be moist. Close the bottle up with just the lid open and leave them. And just beware that if they are summer flowering snapdragons, then they're going to lag behind. They're going to look like they're not doing very well. And that's just because the conditions that they need aren't being met yet. But you can still start them in like now, basically, and they will be fine. It's a really good method, actually. Now, the only problem I had with the winter sowing method was that I just would sow too many because they're so small. And I would end up sort of losing a lot because they would grow leggy and compete inside the bottle. Often I had the summer flowering ones and I sort of discarded the bottle thinking these snapdragons aren't going to amount to anything, because I could see on YouTube other people's snapdragons were already flowering or really big. And I was thinking, why are mine so pathetic? And that was when I realised there were these different varieties, and then they would come on, and then I remember having this burgundy crop of these beautiful magenta Costa snapdragons later on in the year, and they were absolutely gorgeous. I can't remember the exact name of them, but so just bear that in mind. What else is there to say on snapdragons? Not really anything other than that, they're just really beautiful flowers. So I definitely recommend growing snapdragons. And even if you just grow them for the seeds, so that you just have your own stock of seeds every year and just give them away to friends or whatever. If you have friends who already grow snapdragons, get your seeds off them, because, they're free. And yeah, I just can't recommend them enough. They are definitely a cottage garden flower. And I've definitely seen pictures of the late Queen Elizabeth standing in front of many a snapdragon in many of her regal gardens even. So I definitely recommend snapdragons as a firm favourite for your cottage garden. And if you are a beginner, try the winter sowing method. So hope that helped. I'll see you again in my next video.